On the trade map of North America, a seismic shift is quietly taking shape. Three nations, the US, Canada, and Mexico, stand at a crossroads, each facing a different direction, yet all fully aware that any decision made now could reshape the entire regional order. At the heart of this turmoil is the United States, once considered the continent's sole gateway to economic power. But now, Washington is grappling with a staggering national debt, surpassing $37 trillion, a number that no longer sounds the alarm, but rather haunts the national psyche. At the same time, surging inflation has turned utility bills, grocery carts, and even gas station prices into daily burdens for ordinary Americans. The economic might that once seemed unshakable now resembles a cracked tower, one strong gust away from collapsing. The irony is striking. While Washington believed that tariffs and political pressure would easily bring its neighbors to heel, the opposite has unfolded. Canada and Mexico, the smaller players compared to the US, did not buckle. Not only did they stand their ground, but they've begun to turn the tide. A surprising reversal is underway. Instead of the US leading and coercing, it is now the neighbors seeking to free themselves from its gravitational pull. Supply chains that once tightly bound the northern and southern borders are beginning to chart new paths. The North American trade map is no longer a unified block. It's being torn into pieces. The atmosphere feels like an emergency summit of history itself. Leaders are being forced to choose, to stand firm or to change course, to cling to the past or step into a new order. And amid the chaos, people are beginning to look back at the root of it all. What led to this turning point? The answer lies neither in Canada nor in Mexico. It all began with a misstep in Washington, a decision that seemed shrewd at the time, but turned out to be a bullet fired straight into its own foot. To understand how it all unraveled, we need to go back to August 2025, the moment when the US unleashed a wave of controversial tariffs on Canada. In August 2025, Washington officially announced one of the most controversial decisions in the history of North American trade, a 35% tariff on imports from Canada. The statement was delivered with a hardline tone, backed by a string of justifications stitched together to form what seemed like a solid argument, from fentanyl control to Canada's vote on Palestine at the United Nations, and the ever-convenient excuse of national security. The US administration aimed to send a message that it was strong enough to corner its opponent and force Ottawa to the negotiating table, ready to accept whatever terms were laid down. But what Washington may have failed to realize was that it was walking itself straight into a contradictory and dangerous game. Historically, Canada had often been forced into submission under Southern trade pressure, but the context of 2025 was entirely different. Canada was no longer just the younger sibling in a dependent relationship. It had grown into a resource powerhouse, a crucial link in global supply chains for energy, food, minerals, and finance. While Washington believed that slapping tariffs would shake Canada's footing, they had fundamentally miscalculated. Their neighbor was no longer the weaker side. That was their first strategic mistake, underestimating Canada's latent strength. The second mistake, timing. At a moment when the US was already stretched thin, battling inflation and a ballooning national debt, delivering another economic blow was like tightening a noose around its own neck. Analysts quickly labeled it a self-inflicted wound because the impact didn't stop at Canada. It rippled straight into the heart of the US domestic economy. What Washington intended as a preemptive strike turned into a burden that fell squarely on the shoulders of American consumers and businesses. More critically, the decision inadvertently shifted Canada from a defensive stance to an offensive one. Ottawa seized the moment to show the world it was ready to stand its ground and even carve out a new path independent of the US orbit. For Mexico, the move was a wake-up call. If Canada could be targeted today, Mexico might be next. And so, within just a matter of weeks, Washington, once the center of gravity in the region, had managed to isolate itself on the very ground it used to call its own backyard. But the fallout didn't stop at geopolitics. The 35% tariff didn't just fail to weaken Canada, it ignited an unprecedented chain reaction in the US economy. Retail systems began to wobble, prices climbed by the day, factories were forced to consider scaling back production, and entire industries faced the looming threat of losing their markets. In other words, from one misguided decision in Washington, America had triggered an economic undercurrent, a growing wave now threatening to wash away what little stability remained. And right here, we begin to see the full chaotic picture unfold, the chain reaction gripping the US economy. In the early days after the 35% tariff was enacted, Washington still believed it was merely a short-term shock, a jolt that would soon pass, allowing things to return to normal. But reality didn't follow the script they had written. Within weeks, a chain reaction spread across the US economy, from supermarkets to gas stations, from utility bills to factory floors. Everyday goods Americans had long taken for granted, milk, meat, lumber, aluminum, industrial components from Canada, suddenly spiked in price, turning the end-of-month grocery run into a source of anxiety. For middle-class families already struggling under inflation, every dollar and cent now required careful calculation. Fuel prices also began to swing wildly as Canadian oil and natural gas, now burdened with reciprocal tariffs, became too expensive. U.S. energy companies were forced to turn to more distant markets, driving up costs even further. That, in turn, rippled through transportation and logistics, sending shipping fees soaring. Already strained businesses now faced mounting pressure, with many resorting to layoffs or shrinking operations. This economic contraction unfolded like a line of falling dominoes, throwing the labor market into deeper instability. Beyond U.S. borders, American exports took a sharp hit. Longtime international buyers, once dependent on American supply chains, began turning to alternative markets in Europe, Asia, and ironically, Canada itself. The pressure of losing customers began to crush entire sectors, from agriculture to tech. Industry associations warned that this was no passing fever, not a short-term downturn, but a structural shift. The U.S. was losing its standing as a reliable supplier. And once a partner's trust is broken, regaining it is far from easy. The bitterest irony? It was American workers. The very people promised that tariffs would protect their jobs, who became the most direct victims. Many factories in the Midwest, reliant on Canadian materials and components, found themselves operating at a crawl. Assembly lines for cars, industrial equipment, even food processing plants all faced disruption. Workers were laid off just as the cost of living kept climbing. The promise of job protection suddenly revealed itself as a public betrayal, planting a slow-burning resentment across American society. Amid the chaos, a new reality began to emerge. Canada wasn't just holding firm against the tariffs, it was using them as a catalyst to reshape its strategy. From a reactive, defensive stance, Ottawa shifted into an active, forward-leaning posture, no longer waiting for Washington to ease up, but forging its own new path. And in that pivotal moment, a country once seen as dependent began to show the profile of a regional power, one ready to rewrite the rules of North American trade on its own terms. At a time when Washington was confidently tightening its tariff stranglehold, Ottawa chose a different path, not loud protest or outrage, but calm resolve. Prime Minister Mark Carney, drawing on his deep background in finance and his signature Canadian cool, swiftly sent a clear message. Ottawa would not accept any one-sided deal from the United States. Rather than backing down, Canada set out to erect firm defenses of its interests and began redrawing its trade map on its own terms. Plans that had been in the works for years were suddenly fast-tracked. Ports on both the Pacific and Atlantic coasts were upgraded. Massive investments were poured into transcontinental rail lines connecting Canada with the Arctic and Mexico. A new network of modern highways was designed to minimize reliance on cross-border trade with the U.S. What was once seen as merely a logistical corridor for American commerce was steadily transforming into a new hub, a place where global goods could flow directly, bypassing Washington altogether. What stunned observers wasn't just the strategy, it was the speed and decisiveness with which Ottawa acted. Within months, Canada not only withstood the tariff blow, but flipped the crisis into opportunity. U.S. companies, long accustomed to holding the upper hand, now had to learn how to play by Canada's rules if they wanted access to northern resources and markets. The relationship was no longer lopsided, it was becoming a chessboard, with Ottawa holding key strategic pieces. Mark Carney put it bluntly during a press conference, "Canada does not seek confrontation, but we will never accept coercion." That declaration was more than political theater. It was a signal that Canada had stepped out from America's shadow and was asserting its independence with conviction. No longer merely reacting to Washington's decisions, Canada was now actively shaping a new order. And in the process of that transformation, Canada quickly discovered it wasn't alone. To the south, Mexico, a nation that had also endured repeated tariff threats and political pressure from the US, was watching Ottawa's every move with interest. A shared experience of economic bullying, combined with an urgent need to break free from Washington's grip, began to draw the two nations closer. From this alignment, a new alliance started to take shape, a Canada-Mexico axis, one that, for the first time in modern history, dared to stand shoulder to shoulder with the United States on the map of North America. In the midst of a rapidly shifting trade landscape, a new axis has taken shape, and it caught Washington off guard: Canada and Mexico. Long seen as the smaller players in the North American game, the two nations suddenly found common ground, a shared refusal to remain shackled by America's heavy-handed dominance. Their alignment of interests, coupled with relentless pressure from Washington's tariff policies, transformed them from isolated defenders into a calculated and strategic alliance. No longer standing alone, Ottawa and Mexico City joined forces to launch a wave of joint infrastructure projects. Rail lines were mapped to connect Mexico's Pacific ports with Canada's industrial hubs, creating a transcontinental transport corridor that bypassed U.S. territory altogether. Ports like Lázaro Cárdenas in Mexico and Prince Rupert in Canada were expanded and modernized to accommodate mega container ships from Asia and Europe. Energy systems, from renewable electricity to liquefied natural gas, were developed in tandem, aiming to build a self-sufficient North American trade arc, operating beyond Washington's reach. The message this alliance sent was crystal clear. If the U.S. had long been the front door to North American trade, then Canada and Mexico were now building a sturdy side entrance. International businesses, wary of the growing political risks tied to U.S. trade policy, began turning toward this new door, seeing it as a safer, longer-term alternative. For the first time, the North American power map featured a parallel axis to the United States, shaking the very foundation of the order Washington had enforced for decades. This partnership carried significance far beyond economics. Geopolitically, it was a breakthrough. Mexico, once dismissed as a southern buffer zone, was being elevated into a new position, a critical link in an emerging global trade alliance. Canada, historically pressured into compliance, had now found an ally to amplify its strength and expand its strategic reach. The two complemented each other perfectly. Mexico brought labor force advantages and geographic proximity to global markets. Canada contributed abundant resources and financial muscle. Washington likely never imagined its own policies would serve as the catalyst for such a partnership. But as container trains began rolling along newly built routes and investment capital poured into shared infrastructure, it became clear this was no temporary reaction. It was a historic turning point. The Canada-Mexico axis had formed, and with it, a new engine for North America was beginning to roar to life. But this alliance isn't built solely on infrastructure or energy. Its real strength, its secret weapon, lies in a less visible but enormously powerful resource: Canada's massive pension funds. In particular, the Maple 8, a group of 8 powerful Canadian pension funds, have quietly become the financial backbone of this entire new axis. Few could have predicted that Canada's quiet ascent in the trade standoff wouldn't be powered by the vast oil fields of Alberta or the sweeping mineral reserves of the Arctic North, but by something seemingly distant from politics: pension funds. Known collectively as the Maple 8, these are Canada's 8 largest pension funds, holding over 2 trillion Canadian dollars in assets. That figure doesn't just represent Social Security's strength. It embodies a financial engine capable of reshaping global trade dynamics. Unlike conventional pension funds in many countries, the Maple 8 have long operated with a global mindset. They invest in ports, railways, renewable energy, real estate, and advanced technology across continents. And in the face of U.S. tariffs, the Maple 8 became the financial backbone of the Canada-Mexico alliance. Rather than waiting for foreign capital, it was Canadian money that flowed south, turning infrastructure blueprints into real-world mega projects. Mexico's ports were expanded with Maple 8 funding. Cross-border rail links bore the fingerprints of Maple 8. Even offshore wind farms in the Gulf of California carried their financial backing. This was Ottawa's most underrated soft power move, using long-term financial capital to build a new, more resilient trade order, one less tethered to Washington. As shipping containers from Asia began docking in Mexican ports and traveling by rail directly to Canadian industrial hubs, all without touching U.S. soil, the North American economic map was irreversibly redrawn. Washington was no longer the only gateway, and this structural transformation was fueled quietly, steadily, by the money behind Maple 8. The message was unmistakable. Canada was no longer just relying on natural resources. It had the financial sophistication to shape the game itself. But even as Maple 8 laid down a powerful economic foundation, Ottawa still held one more card, an ace with potentially game-changing consequences. That ace was energy, the one sector where U.S. dependence on Canada ran so deep, a single squeeze could bring the American industrial machine to a grinding halt. In the grand game of power, energy is always the most irreplaceable piece, and no one understands that better than Canada. Beneath Alberta's vast plains lie endless reserves of heavy crude oil, capable of accounting for more than 60% of all U.S. oil imports on any given day. And it's not just oil. Natural gas flows continuously through massive pipelines to the south, keeping America's industrial grid and millions of households humming. When a resident in Detroit flips on a light switch, when factories in Chicago fire up their production lines, when trucks barrel down the interstate, all of it, in some way, runs on energy from the north. The irony is striking. While Washington unleashed tariffs as a warning shot, it overlooked just how deeply it relies on the very nation it sought to pressure. Should Ottawa choose to tighten supply, or simply reroute flows to Asian markets, the U.S. would plunge into an immediate energy crisis. Gas prices would spike, supply chains would grind to a halt, and the storm of inflation would intensify even further. This is a card Canada has never had to play out loud, but everyone knows it's on the table, a silent weapon of negotiation. Canada doesn't need to shout to prove its strength. By simply keeping oil pumping and gas flowing, it already holds powerful leverage over the world's largest economy. If the Maple 8 represents the financial brain of Canada's new strategic order, then energy is its steady, beating heart, delivering the lifeblood that fuels the emerging power structure Ottawa is quietly but decisively building. The North American landscape today is no longer what it once was. The United States hasn't disappeared, but its position as the sole gateway, the channel through which all trade once flowed, has fractured. The tariffs that once seemed like a surefire strategy have instead become a catalyst, propelling Canada forward, elevating Mexico, and pushing the entire region into a new phase of transformation. This is no longer an order with a single center, but one with multiple anchors, multiple paths, all coexisting and evolving. Canada, once seen as dependent, has shown it can turn pressure into power. Not only did it hold its ground, but it also proactively built its own trade and financial ecosystem, positioning itself as a new regional hub. Mexico, as a close ally, has also found immense value in the partnership, boosting its regional stature, attracting investment, and becoming an indispensable link in the global supply chain. Meanwhile, Washington, long accustomed to setting the rules, is now being forced to face a reality in which power is no longer centralized in its hands. The lesson here extends far beyond North America. In an era of flexible supply chains, strength no longer lies in tariffs or military threats, but in the ability to build resilient alternatives. Those who control these networks hold the true power. And with Maple 8, with energy, with its alliance with Mexico, Canada stands as a clear example that determination, strategic thinking, and long-term planning can reshape the entire board. The bigger question remains unanswered. Will the U.S. adapt its strategy in time, accepting this new reality and learning to coexist in a multi-centered North America? Or will it cling to the old ways, only to one day find itself sidelined on a chessboard that used to be its own backyard? The future is still unwritten, and every move from here could set off consequences far beyond what anyone expects. If you have your own thoughts, insights, or perspectives on this ongoing shift, we'd love to hear them. Drop a comment below and join the conversation. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more in-depth analysis and the latest stories on global geopolitical shifts. Your interest and support are what drive us to keep delivering high-quality content every step of the way.